Welcome to Stories from Foster Care. I'm Niamh Barrett, and in this episode I speak with Paul Harrison, a retired social worker who has occupied many different roles within the care system in Ireland.
When you're recruiting for foster carers, you're not looking for sainthood, you're looking for ordinary people, you know. It's just that ordinary homestead that can bring out the best in children.
In our conversation we talked about his book, which is called Hanged If You Do. He shared some of the experiences from his career as a social worker that have stayed with him over the years.
It's a very, very difficult thing to remove a child from its family, particularly against the will of the parents, you know, which often I've done, you know, entering people's home with maybe a couple of Gardaí and a warrant and removing their children. It doesn't get more personal than that.
And he spoke passionately about the need to go back to basics in the childcare system. So, Paul, welcome to the Stories from Foster Care podcast. Thanks for coming in.
Delighted to be here.
And you have a unique perspective on the care of children in this state. And I thought rather than me introducing all of the things to our listeners that you've done and been involved in, how would you describe your work life in relation to, how would you sum it up if you could?
Well, it's difficult to sum up, but I suppose I started like many social workers just on the front line, primarily involved in child protection and welfare, and did that for a number of years in a number of places, and really I suppose worked my way through the ranks then into various management positions, you know, but basically it's all about the protection and welfare of children, no matter what particular role you have, you know.
So you were involved in the health boards, and then you were involved in the establishment of Tusla as well at that time.
I was. There were a number of incarnations. It started off with the health board system, and later then around 2000 we had the Eastern Regional Health Authority, which lasted for a short amount of time, and then moving on to the HSE, you know, so I survived these various incarnations. You know, we seem to be in a constant state of change for a decade or more, you know, but I ended up, on the initial management team which established Tusla. We were in shadow form within the HSE for about a year before it went live on January 1, 2014, but that was a great experience.
And I'm just wondering, what drew you into social work?
Yeah, well, it was a roundabout journey in many ways. As a school leaver, I was more interested in writing than anything else, and I actually went into advertising for a few years. In fact, I at one stage I was working with Joe Duffy, who ended up taking a similar, the broadcaster Joe Duffy. We ended up taking a similar route because he went into social work as well at the same time. But I did that for a few years, advertising, and then I volunteered, like many young people did, in Dublin at the time with the Simon community, and I worked in the night shelter there one night a week. And the office had about 2 or 3 people working full-time, and a vacancy came up, and I decided that I'd go and do that for a while and change the world within a year or two. But I got the bug at that point then with Simon, and I went and trained as a social worker. So I was 23 before I went to college, and so it was a circuitous route. And then I ended up in old money, what was called the Eastern Health Board, working as a child protection social worker.
Your book, Paul, that came out last year, 2021, is called Hanged If You Do. And in that, it's a wonderfully vivid account of many of the experiences you've had during your working life, and the title itself points to the difficulties of social work, part of social work. And what kept you going through all of that time?
Yeah, well, it's a difficult area of work, but I suppose in terms of what kept me going would be a conviction that somebody had to do it, as it were, and just the basic concept of protecting children from harm is such a fundamental thing, you know. Just the conviction of getting that right, I suppose, is what kept me going. It's a very, very difficult thing to remove a child from its family, particularly against the will of the parents, you know, which often I've done, you know, entering people's home with maybe a couple of Gardaí and a warrant and removing their children. It doesn't get more personal than that, you know. So you have to be absolutely convinced that you're right in the decision decision you're making, But I suppose it was that conviction that kind of drove me, and I suppose the belief that somebody had to get in there and do that piece of dirty work really on behalf of society.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there experiences like that stand out for you now that you may not have realised at the time, but sort of looking back may have been forks in the road for you in your professional life?
Yeah, there are a couple of significant milestones over the 4 decades or so. Certainly when I started in the late 70s, it was all about child protection, and it was in the wake of a couple of major scandals in the UK, and a lot of the original senior social workers that set up the service in Ireland had come from that environment, So the focus was very much on society protecting children from parents who were seen in some way as inadequate, and what the Americans call a kind of a gotcha approach, there was nothing helpful about it, So the vibe really was that I would go into somebody's home and say, you're a very inadequate parent, and if you don't get better, we're going to take your children off you. And somewhere along the line, between, I suppose, the evolution of thinking, and in particular the publication of the Task Force on Childcare in 1980 was a landmark where it really put family support on the agenda, and suddenly we had to have another look at this, and instead of the kind of jackboot approach, it was we kind of flipped to I'm here, how can I help, as opposed to the more policing role that we had adopted before. That was a major landmark, And I'd have to give great credit to the senior social workers who in the early 70s established the social work service within the old health board system, Most of them, if not all, had come back from the UK, from that environment, but they were really the pioneers of what we are all doing today, and there was literally a couple of handfuls of staff compared to the thousands that are around Ireland today.
Jumping to the very end of your book, Paul, just prompted by something you said there, you end the book with this quote: "One manager turns to the others and says, 'What do you think about forgetting the whole thing and just going back to trying to help people a bit?' That your approach back then was, 'How can I help? I'm here. How can I help?' What has happened in between, in your view, to move away from the simplicity of 'I'm here, how can I help'?
Yeah, I make the point in the book that over those 4 decades or so, there's been a major shift whereby the services are now very highly regulated and very heavily managed. And I suppose it's that move into managerialism that maybe, in retrospect, I think has gone a step too far. I think obviously we have to plan. If we don't plan, we just resign ourselves to be at the mercy of events. But in that it shouldn't be over the top in relation to the level of widget counting that I see now, where children seem to be get less mention than particular targets and activities and all the rest of it. So a little bit of the humanity has gone out, I think, with the rise of managerialism. And I suppose I was taking a poke at that in the book and saying it would be nice to refocus and remember why we all came into the business in the first place.
Yeah, sure. Something that I sometimes sense is around, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, is this concept of risk as a sort of somewhat of a barrier, like organisational risk, the possibility of legal action of some kind. Does that resonate for you as a kind of possibly negative development?
It does, but I think it's part of that managerialism thing that I think has gone too far. The concept of risk management. I mean, the idea of minding and protecting children is the business of risk management, but I think a whole industry has grown up around that, so I think it can be taken too far. I mean, essentially, when you're recruiting families, I mean, there was a book, I think, or certainly an academic course back in the day called Recruiting Safer Families. It wasn't recruiting safe families, So, and the same applies to the social workers. Social workers, occasionally social workers can be a threat to children as well. So those threats are there, they're there in society, and it's not. So social workers and foster carers are part of society. So there's going to be some bad eggs as well, So I think we need to balance that kind of fear of risk, but really, child protection is all about taking those risks, measuring them, and then taking them, So I wouldn't be fazed by that, And I particularly for foster carers, not to get too hung up on that kind of as a concept, I think that's important,
When we think of risk, we often think about risk avoidance, right?
Yeah.
Rather than risk taking, which is a very different way of coming at it. Yeah.
It is, yeah. I mean, I think that's the point, and sometimes, you'll have HICWA then, say, inspecting the Tusla, which is their job, and that's fine, but some of the shortfalls that they come up with probably sound like enormous risks, but in fact are maybe are not, where for example, particular intervention may be outside a timeline. It's not going to affect the child greatly, So I mean, and I think it's important that while we're ticking off all these boxes, that we don't lose sight on the core task of looking after children. I think that's the important thing, and sometimes risk management can become a means of it on its own. And I hate to see that, I think that's when we start to lose the plot, and where this rise of managerialism takes hold.
And it takes up so much time for social workers, right?
It does, yeah. It takes a huge amount of time, and then you find that the eye is taken off the ball then of the core business of childcare in terms of the accountability of ticking the boxes, It drives me nuts, and it's very hard to. How do we get back to basics, which comes back to the scenario you were mentioning earlier in the book. It's about trying to get that balance and really just keep the focus the whole time on what we're all there to do, which is looking after kids.
Do you have a sense yourself of what getting back to basics would look like? What needs to happen?
I think to keep it as simple as possible, and in the context of foster care, as I say, that relationship between the social worker and the foster carer is very important, And what I'd be to saying to foster carers in that situation is to realise your own importance, and not to be fazed by the state side of that relationship. They are the key players in that relationship, and nothing happens without them opening up their homes and their hearts to a large extent to the kids they look after, and to feel that sense of their own importance. I think that's very that's vital in the task of foster care.
This is Rick Panza.
This is Raymond Nolan.
And you're listening to the Stories from Foster Care podcast.
Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
So how could social workers or social work in a broader sense help foster carers to experience that importance?
I suppose it's coming back to kind of balancing that partnership, and to be less concerned with the rules and the regulations, which tend to stifle good interventions, and to keep it focused on the needs of the child and the relationship between the foster carers and the child and the social worker and the child, and to keep that little triangle of relationships at the fore, and to be less worried about the administrative requirements that tend to drive that relationship too often.
And something we come across a lot is that sometimes the relationship is interrupted. Social worker turnover is a big issue as well, for foster carers and obviously the children too. And not to lay everything at social workers' sort of door, but how do you view that problem? What's your perspective on the turnover issue?
Yeah, it is a problem, and it's a problem in not only in relation to alternative care and foster care. You see it in child protection as well. You know, people say after a couple of years, you know what, there's an easier way of making a living. You know, so I think there needs to be greater emphasis from an organisational point of view on the retention of staff and what that looks like. So it's minding staff maybe a little bit more. And making it a bit more palatable. And there may be also a case for financial incentive in terms to keep people in that particular line of work, because social workers largely they come into, say, Tusla, the state organisation, and many of them vote with their feet and go into more therapeutic environments, which are challenging but not as challenging, you know, and there's a big drain of staff into that kind of that employment pool. So I think recruitment, but then after that retention and a lot more attention paid to minding staff. Not suggesting Tusla don't do it, but maybe to do it in a bit more of an organised and systematic way, you know. And there's plenty of evidence to show that social workers leave their jobs much more because of red tape than they do because of other. Because the nature of the work, it's more the bureaucratic elements of it. You know, there's plenty of research to suggest that. You know.
That's interesting, because it was my impression that people might burn out through secondary trauma or, you know, the difficulties of what they're meeting, but it's actually the red tape.
Yeah, red tape is can be a killer, you know, that to a lot of people, yeah, it's just, I suppose it's kind of the final straw, you know. But there are certainly elements of vicarious trauma in relation to the work. I mean, I decades later still can wake up with the start in the middle of the night thinking about things I've done or have been done to me, you know, and it's not necessarily violence, that's easy. It's more the psychological battles that sometimes go on, you know, that can be and the major trauma that can occur for people in love triangles or that sort of thing, you know, that can have a massive effect on not only the child but and the foster care, but the social worker as well, you know. If
it's okay to ask you, and it's fine if it isn't, could you tell me about something like that, without obviously going into the minute detail, you know, but what would be such a thing, an example of something that would land on you like that years later?
Yeah. I can remember taking two kids into care in an emergency situation. We suspected that they were being sexually abused, and we brought them for assessment, which at that time was undertaken in the Rotunda Maternity Hospital. It was before it was a forerunner of what exists now. It was determined on that day that the children were being abused and should be taken into care straight away. We acted on that. I went back and we got an emergency care order. I arrived up around dinner time to the flat where they lived with, as I recall, two Garda cars. And we entered the house with the warrant and 2 or 3 Gardaí. One of the children hid in a wardrobe, the other was under a table. I had to physically remove them. And then the father had to be restrained by Gardaí. He was pinned on the ground as we put them at the back of the car and drove them away. I mean, it's hard to imagine the intrusion into everybody's life that causes, you know, including the neighbours, I can tell you, who were all out on the balcony. I followed that up then the following day by visit. They were placed in a children's home initially. I followed that up the next day to see how the kids were getting on. The little girl was about 7 or 8, and when I arrived she hid behind a door when she saw me coming, because this all-powerful person who plucked her from her world was back, and what was he going to do next, you know. That stays with me, you know. You learn from it, of course, as well, in terms of trying to do things more sensitively, but it's a brutal business when it comes down to that, and but you just try and say to yourself driving home, somebody had to do it, you know.
How do you cope with it when it comes back?
Well, I have developed a pretty good Teflon outer layer, which you need to do. So it needs to wash away on the drive home to a large extent, and so you develop that tough outer layer. So you try and depersonalise it. It meant that for years and years, I would never watch a drama on the telly that had anything to do with childcare, but also even I could never watch television programmes that to do with accident and emergency departments, because it was the same vibe. I thought, no, this isn't entertaining, this is dramatic, and I can't do it. So I sheltered myself from that and just enjoy family life and hobbies and things like that, But as I say, things do pop into your mind and your dreams. You'd be amazed, years later you still think, oh God, I remember that, But that's why it's so important in retrospect when you look back to say, at least I know I was right, And occasionally you'll get kids who had been in care who might phone you up and say, you were great, or thanks very much for doing such and such. It's a massive reward when that happens. Admittedly, usually it's the opposite, but I like to remember the good bits.
Yeah, very wise. Do people get in touch to give you the opposite sometimes? Does that ever happen?
It does, yeah, but usually at the time, I've been belted about the place many's the time, or threatened, assaulted, all that sort of thing. It goes with the territory. But or you'd get, I suppose, in the old-fashioned thing, what you call poison pen letters, anonymous letters going in, say, telling me how bad I was about certain things. But sure, look at, you get that in all walks of life, and you just have to keep going, and have a bit of courage in your own convictions,
It does strike me that it does take a lot of courage, and to be the person driving away, telling yourself somebody had to do it, somebody had to advocate for the child.
Yeah, I think you really do have to believe that you were right, particularly on that crucial thing of separating a child forcibly from their parent. It doesn't get more personal than that, and it's traumatic for everybody. Yeah, so you have to do that with a degree of certainty, And the other thing you have to balance is it going to have the desired effect, and it's another issue with care, that we don't know enough about how well care works, so I'd like to see a lot more kind of research gone into that in terms of what works best and all the rest of it. We take for granted that when we remove a child from a dangerous family that we will heal them or make them better, but that often the damage is done, and the last thing you want to do is pile on more damage, But when it's all over and the child looks back, was it better? I hope so,
Thinking of a child leaving a situation like that and coming into the home of a foster carer, carrying a lot of trauma, possibly even pre-birth trauma, and all the way through. And what a complex relationship or task it is for the foster carer then, to receive that. Do you feel that foster carers are informed enough, supported enough? I mean, let me put it another way. What would you say to somebody who is considering fostering?
Yeah, I mean, well, go into it with your eyes open and make sure that you don't have too rosy a picture of changing the world or even the life of a couple of children. I mean, you're getting the loan of some children or a part of their lives, and be realistic about the task when you go into it. As you suggest, very often the damage is done before they arrive. So I think that realism is important, and to maybe lower your expectations a little bit, but open your home, open your heart. It doesn't it doesn't take a rocket scientist, but it does take that enormous generosity, and hopefully the rest will follow, and there have been great experiences. There's one I recall that I tell in the book where, again, we took a child into care in traumatic circumstances, but the point I wanted to bring out in this instance was that when I visited her the following day, she was sitting up with the foster carers having her breakfast and was charmed with the whole idea of a square meal, a clean bed, and people who were minding her. And she said to me, if my ma comes to visit me, is it okay if I ask her, can I stay for a bit, And so she wanted, she knew that she was onto a good thing, and that they were foster carers who continued took her in the middle of the night and ended up minding her for several years, and it was a great success story, met all the needs and put an awful lot of that hurt behind, Yeah.
Yeah, and that square meal, that predictable meal time, that clean, but it counts for a lot, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And just the ordinary minding of people, and having that open heart and not being worried about, don't get too therapeutic about the whole thing, just do what you do naturally, And when you're recruiting for foster carers, you're not looking for sainthood, you're looking for ordinary people, As Geoffrey Shannon often says, where it's ordinary people doing extraordinary things, but it's just that ordinary homestead that can bring out the best in children,
When relationships between social workers and foster carers are going well, what does that look like, would you say?
I think it looks like a partnership. I mean, obviously, the social workers have a statutory obligation, and there's a certain amount of authority goes with that, But I think, and I've looked back on this in terms of my own relationship with foster carers, and the best relationships were with families where there was a quite an equal partnership, And there's no point in codding ourselves. It's not a friendship, but that doesn't mean you can't be friendly, But it's a partnership in which I think a little bit of equality needs to be there, and to recognise the enormous natural resource that foster carers bring, and I think and to respect that, and to give a proper voice to foster carers.
What would you say to a social worker who was qualifying and considering going into child protection, or specifically fostering social work?
Yeah, I'd say prepare for a white knuckle ride, I suppose, But that being said, I think that there are massive rewards to be had. I think if people stay at it, my advice to them would be to keep your eye on the ball, and that's the child, and not to be overwhelmed by the administrative requirements of the job. To keep focused on relationships and nurturing those. See the foster carers as partners, and it's very important, I think, for new social workers, all social workers, not to see them foster carers mainly as service providers. They're more than that. They're partners in care, and not to see them as one might view a commercial enterprise or something like that. It's a lot more personal than that, But go in, enjoy it, but don't be overwhelmed by the business end of it, and keep focused on probably why you went into it in the first place, which was the humanity, to make life better for a couple of people,
Paul, it's been wonderful to talk to you, and I feel like we could talk for hours. There's so much in your book. I really want to recommend it to people. Hanged If You Do. I think it's published by Orphan Press, available in all good bookshops. But before we come to a close, just to ask you, is there anything you would like to add, or anything you would like to say?
No, I'm looking to the future of foster care and what that would look like. There are a couple of things that I would like to see. I'd like to see more specialist foster care being developed, where if you look at some of the placements, children might be in foster care for a long time, and when they come into adolescence, the difficulties arise, and the placement may break down, and then move into residential care. I think maybe to invest in more specialist foster care placements, where a little bit of training for some cohorts of foster carers could be provided to keep those placements going. I also see a trend currently in residential care where it's now it seems perfectly acceptable to place children under 12 in residential care. In my day, there was you'd need a special dispensation from the department to place a child of 12 or younger in residential care, where now it's taken as a given. I don't like that trend. I think foster care works particularly well for younger children, and then they can grow into their adolescence and teenage years much better. So I'd like to see some foster parents being given maybe a little bit of specialist training that would assist, and also a bit more research, as I say, to figure out what works best for the kids. I think we're making presumptions that care works when it doesn't work all the time, and I think we need to lift the bonnet on that a good bit more going into the future.
Wonderful, thanks. I hope those are taken up. And again, thank you for talking to us and sharing your wisdom, your experience, your perspective. It's really, really helpful to hear. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
That was a really interesting conversation with Paul, giving a perspective that we don't often hear. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. His book, again, is called Hanged If You Do, and it's published by Orphan Press, and we can highly recommend it. See you next time on Stories from Foster Care.